current electoral system has drawn extensive criticism for rendering elected representatives unaccountable to voters. The system has worked well to represent minority parties, along with the recurrent ANC majorities in the National Assembly and in most of the country's 9 provinces. Well, let's delve a little bit deeper into this. We're joined by a former president of the Azanian People's Organization, Musibudi Manyena, and former Democratic Alliance leader, Tony Leon. Good evening to both of you, and thank you so much for your time. So I wanted to talk about this issue of accountability and what is it about our current framework, even looking just at local government, that does not allow for opportunity for citizens to hold those in power accountable. But I want to begin with just getting each of your own reflections about where you believe this country is, and specifically when you look at the outcome of this vote, what do you make of the state of affairs? Mr. Manyena, I'll give you the first opportunity.
Well, I think our democracy is certainly progressing, and the people are still going to the polls, although not in the numbers that are required. And I think that this is a function of the paucity of civic education, especially for the black majority who are not so old in the voting game. So I think that our democracy is still working. We are still voting. We are not resorting to undemocratic ways of changing government. So that's a plus. But I think that we need to have more of our people going to the polls than we are seeing presently.
Mr. Leon?
Yes, well, Mr. Manyena and I served together in Parliament. We're old friends, so we broadly agree on that. But I do think Monday's election is really a benchmark of whatever you call it for South Africa, a watershed, in the sense that, you know, we have a maturing democracy at 2 levels. One, the ANC, for the first time, I think in 12 elections, national, local, no longer represents a majority. It's below 50%. Number 2, very few South Africans, relatively speaking, 1/3, went to vote. And that in itself, you know, whether it's a matter of I don't think it's a matter of voter education. Respectfully, I disagree there. I think it's people who've completely checked out of the political system. But ironically, now that the ANC, this overwhelming behemoth of the party, has been humbled and really faces the prospect, I think, of losing its national power footprint in 2024, I think people might engage again in the political process. And the third observation I'd make, and this is based on the news broadcast you just did, I counted no fewer than 4 major parties, the DA, the IFP, Action South Africa, and Good, which is more regional, who basically said, we're not going to do business to prop up the ANC in South Africa or in the cities and towns in a coalition government. And, you know, if you go back to the time Mr. Manyena and I were in Parliament together, he for ZAPA, me for the DA, it was inconceivable that there would be a national political conversation or local political conversation in which a significant number of political actors, some with the majority of votes in places like Tshwane, would say we won't deal with the ANC because the ANC dominated almost the entire political space. And the fact that there's been such a reduction in authority delivered by the voters, I do think is a moment of deep national significance, although obviously it arose locally in the context of a municipal election.
At the heart of the concerns by many citizens is not just the lack of delivery of services, but the lack of accountability. Often communities are told, Mr. Manyena, that they have to hold their elected officials accountable. What is it about the framework of local government that often makes this difficult, even though these are individuals that are supposed to be at the coalface of delivery? If anybody is likely to interact with any form of government entity or government services, it begins at the local level.
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think the system itself negates accountability. I just think that we are settled with an environment, firstly, that over-promises but under-delivers. And then there has been complacency and corruption, especially corruption, that, amongst other things, manifested itself in the appointment of people who know absolutely nothing, have no capacity to operate at a municipal level. Incidentally, the municipal level is a lot more technical than even the national level. And so you need people with competence who will be able to deal with those issues there. But they must also have the conscience and the ethics to know that they are accountable to their people, and they must the people who have elected them, and therefore go back to them to account for what has happened, whether they have succeeded or they have not succeeded in doing what they are doing. But I think that the employment of so many people who are incompetent, underqualified for the work they are supposed to do at the municipal level is responsible for what we are doing. And we have allowed for far too long corruption to embed itself in public life in this country.
Mm. Unfortunately, this conversation around accountability also leads to some individuals and some communities coming together and having to force their local governments through the courts to provide services. Mr. Leon, some of those efforts have not even yielded results. A classic example becomes what happened in Makana, where you had independent organizations taking the local council to court for not delivering water, and still that decision was opposed in the courts by government.
It was opposed by the government, and the government lost. But, you know, if you look at Makana, formerly Grahamstown, where they had a very spirited group of independents standing on a citizens' front ticket, the ANC won that municipality. And, you know, just to go to your point about people holding their representatives to account, there was a rather morbid story in the Sunday Times this morning that I think it was 3 councillors who died before the election day but couldn't be removed from the ballot. Their names were elected. So, you know, I don't think people, wherever they are, pay too much attention to the individuals they elect to represent them. I'm in a hugely DA area here in Cape Town, from where I'm speaking to you. There was no local campaign to speak of by any of the parties. You weren't aware of even who the candidates were. So I think we're still a very party political dominant system. And the fact, actually, the independence in this election, you'll recall the Financial Mail last week had a headline story, Independence Day. Actually, with a few exceptions in places like Ceres and elsewhere in the Cape Boerland, the independents didn't really make much effect, or didn't effectuate much change in this election. So we're still stuck with a party political system and parties new and old determining who representatives are. And therefore, I think, just to build on Mr. Mangena's point, an enormous amount rests on the political parties as to the quality of the candidates they represent to nominate and then hold to account afterwards. And it's not easy, but I think that's the next step forward. It might be because of the huge voter stay away and the very significant vote against the governing party and other established parties in this election that there might now be a concentration of minds to actually improve the caliber of elected councillors' performance. But that's, I hope, not a definite fact.
Given how embedded corruption has become, particularly in the local government sphere, so we've seen in some municipalities that it doesn't matter if you change the face of the ward councillor. The patronage networks have been so deeply entrenched that you know, the system continues as it were. There have been some suggestions from academics that we need a complete overhaul of the local government system and relook at something that will be more fit for purpose. Do you think that's where we are, Mr. Manyana?
I'm not sure about that. whether it needs to be changed or not. But what I know is that it hurts a lot. I've been to Maganda, I've been to Mfuleni, and to see people suffering so much, rubbish everywhere, sewage flowing in the streets, and so on. And there are people who are elected by the people to take care of these things, but they just don't do it. And I think in the majority of cases is lack of expertise, but also corruption. And whether you change the system or not, if you don't have ethical people to do the work, it will not be done. And there are people, for example, I've heard who are saying at both municipal level and as far as the national and provincial level, we must adopt a new system. Well, the system itself does not make ethical people. Yeah, you just have look around the world. Look at Zimbabwe. Are people happy with their government? There it is first past the post, but are they happy? And in our country, my view is that we have a very complex and diverse society. And it is important that we try and accommodate as many people as possible, interest groups as possible, minorities as possible. And if you don't take care of these diversities, then you start having problems like, say, they are having in Ethiopia and other places. So it's important that we are conscious of these things. It is not the system itself, but the caliber and the ethical attributes of the people that we put in positions of responsibility.
Mr. Leon, let me wrap up with you then. We're going to see a week and probably the next 2 weeks of lots of negotiations and horse trading, whatever else you want to call it. There have been some suggestions that Parliament needs to officially look into developing frameworks that will regulate how coalitions work to avoid the crumbling, or even the crumbling that we saw that ultimately leads to greater instabilities in municipalities. What's your thought on that?
I completely disagree. Just to build on the point made by Mr. Mangena, the crisp issue isn't that we don't have the legislative framework. We've got something called the Municipal Finance Management Act, just like we have the Public Finance Management Act. It is the most detailed, prescriptive legislative framework for how municipal officials and councillors are to behave in an ethical and an incorruptible fashion. In fact, we have so much corruption, so much dysfunctionalities, not the problem of a lack of new arrangements or agreements or legislation. It is the lack of enforcement. This is the very simple point. I mean, people need to go to jail for stealing public money at a national, provincial, and local level. And not one single person has so far been successfully interdicted, or at least indicted, convicted, and sent to prison for, what Ramaphosa told us was R1 trillion worth of state capture. Well, you can just bring that right down to local level, and you have thousands of examples of mini-state captures, and none of the capturers have yet been sent to prison. And until that happens, nothing is going to fundamentally change, absent of some extraordinary Damascene conversion that the ANC has on the issue of corruption, which we've seen no sign of in a practical sense. We've heard plenty of rhetorical noise, but no practical change.